All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar. This one is going to be led by Daniel Orenstein, Natalie Gulsrud, Nikolaos, Nikolaidis, and Marie Mimikou. And this is going to be on long-term observations for support of urban and peri-urban social, ecological, technical research, otherwise known as SETS. And Daniel, you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Tessa, and thank you everyone who's attending, both people that I recognize and those who I don't. I just have the honor of introducing really the two speakers, who will be Natalie and Nikos. But I'll just give a really short overview of our thematic working group. It's important that you all know that it is an open thematic working group. That is, it's something that you can join and participate in as well. And the link is on the NATURA website if people are interested. So our working group combines two groups of researchers. One is the European Long-Term Ecosystem Critical Zone and Social Ecological Research Infrastructure, or eLTER for short, which is an infrastructure of observation and research sites and platforms across Europe, and a group of committed NATURA researchers who have been long time associated with NATURA and are all engaged in nature-based solutions research. So the objective of this particular thematic working group, which is one of several that NATURA organizes and sponsors, is twofold. One is to develop a framework for long-term monitoring of the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in urban and peri-urban areas, in particular using the conceptual framing of SETS, or social, ecological, ecological, technological, and technological and social couplings. And the second objective is to utilize the European research infrastructure, eLTER, to conduct that kind of research. So really what we have here is a research infrastructure in search of researchers, and researchers hopefully in search of also a platform in which they can conduct their research and have supporting infrastructure and researchers as well. And fortunately, both of these groups have their conceptual framings, which are actually similar in their holistic approach. The eLTER approach is called the whole systems approach. It looks at long-term ecological and social ecological processes at multiple scales, with an emphasis on the interaction between social and environmental interactions, long-term interactions. And the SETS framework, which is summarized in the article or introduced in the article that I quote here, which looks at the three different domains of social, ecological, and technological, primarily to look at complex problems of sustainability and resilience, in our case, in the urban setting. And if the platform that we have in eLTER that we've set up to conduct such research is one that's based on transdisciplinary research, in which the research itself is driven by stakeholder engagement, and it's co-produced research in which we work with interested stakeholders in transdisciplinary groups, in which the research questions are determined in part by those same stakeholders, and the stakeholders are there to accept or receive the research results, and then that research is discussed within the stakeholder community with the researchers for policy and implement for policy. I'm having trouble with the word for policy relevance. Thank you. And this is the last slide, or the second to last slide, why we think that eLTER may be a good platform to conduct NBS research. And these are two articles coming out of the NATURA community, really pointing out what the most important future research areas are. And really, we believe that eLTER provides this type of setting to conduct the research, whether it's collaborative research, whether it's dependent on long-term observation, and the potential or the promise of doing cross platform comparisons of the effectiveness of NBS in numerous locations across Europe. So we have those advantages. We think this is actually going to be a quite productive collaboration of groups. And now, with no further ado, I'll introduce our two speakers. One has long time experience in NBS research, Natalie Gulsrud from the University of Copenhagen. She is a professor of landscape architecture. And we have Nikos Nikolaidis, who is a professor of, I lost hydrogeochemical engineering at the Technical University of Crete. And he'll be providing an example of long-term observation in Crete, and Natalie Gulsrud will be talking about the application of the SETS framework in Copenhagen. So with one apology that I forget my vocabulary, I turn over to Natalie to continue the discussion.
Thanks, Daniel. Let's see, I will share my screen now. Can everybody see the slide?
Yes.
Perfect. So thanks so much for that nice introduction. Just to be clear, I don't actually have a background in landscape architecture, although I work in the section for landscape architecture and planning. I have more background around the policy aspects. Yet, due to where I sit and the work that I do around urban green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, I have been working in this context, specifically with the ecological and technological aspects and social aspects for the last 10 years. So what I want to speak to today is an example of what long-term data collection in a SETS framing could look like for nature-based solutions research and for the eLTER platform. And I'll be drawing on an example from Copenhagen. So I'll start out with some framing to kind of get us on the same page, and then I'll go into our example. And then at the end, I'll raise some questions and points about why this is relevant for the thematic group and for NATURA and also for NBS research. So the point of departure is that cities are seen by transnational politicians as sites of critical challenges in terms of climate change, adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity crises, but also socioeconomic precarity and disease spreading, as evidenced by our recent sort of crises that we're now in. But they're also seen as sites of solutions. And many policymakers are calling for more holistic approaches, as Daniel was just speaking to. So we need to not only draw on technical approaches, but we also need to think about how those interact with ecological, social, cultural dimensions as well. And in this regard, nature-based solutions becomes a really interesting framing. And nature becomes sort of one of the solutions that policymakers are actively speaking to, funding, and talking about. And in this regard, urban green infrastructure, or sort of the connected infrastructure within the city, from parks to gardens to stormwater management to blue infrastructure, becomes extremely relevant and is highly in focus in cities today. And UGI has a lot of promises, but we have to sort of start asking critical questions that if UGI is sort of seen as a panacea to all of these different challenges that we're facing in our society, who is framing UGI? What kind of solutions are we looking for? And who are the solutions for? What kind of visions come to the forefront? And what kind of solutions come to the forefront? And this is relevant because UGI is not a universal term. It's in fact quite contested. So if we did a literature review, we would see that it could be understood more as sort of a continuum from gray to green infrastructure. These pictures illustrate, the metro, which is gray infrastructure, essentially is also seen as green mobility within that broader umbrella of green infrastructure. A green building is also seen as green infrastructure. And we have a forest here, which illustrates a different type of green infrastructure. And the kind of ways in which green infrastructure is prioritized and implemented are very much determined by local politicians, decision makers, budgetary procedures, and planning over time. In addition, there's increasing social and political stratification in our urban centers. I think what happened under Corona illustrated this, but many of us have been studying these processes for a long time. So what nature is and for whom it is and how people have access to it is critical in terms of just and resilient pathways for our cities. There's also rapid transformations in urban landscapes as land and housing become quickly commodified. Transformations of ownership, but also the type of land use and space that we have are changing rapidly. And not everybody is in agreement with this. And not everybody's a landowner or has actual control over how an urban process is occurring. And for this reason, there's an importance to focus on just and sustainable pathways to climate resilience, where if we go back to the SDGs, no one is left behind, right? So this is a critical policy question. How do we engage voices that are oftentimes marginalized, and also the perspectives of those who live in a place, right? And I think we can extend this argument to beyond the human perspective and engage kind of an ecological justice perspective as well. Given the current biodiversity crisis, how do we engage the more than human perspective? And this is where the SETS perspective becomes interesting, I think, for many of us as researchers, because we're looking at these couplings, not only of the kind of siloed ways in which urban planning is conducted, implemented, development occurs with technological solutions, you know, green spaces over here, social research happening over there, but engages us in really looking at the crossovers. And so that framing here helps us understand why the neighborhood that I will present could be relevant for long-term data collection. So I'm going to focus on a neighborhood in Copenhagen that's been industrial for ages, and over the last 20 years has become post-industrial. It's called the Northern Harbor. And for those of you who've been in Copenhagen, the Northern Harbor obviously is in the northern part of the city and is really sort of what I like to call the last frontier of Copenhagen. So Ian Mell, who I can see is part of the panel here, I took him out there on a bike ride back in June because it just provides these sweeping scenic views of Copenhagen all the way over to Sweden, but you can really see the core of the city. And what's interesting about this place is that it has a 30 to 50 year development timeline. So the whole area is owned by the City and Harbor Agency, which is a public-private partnership in Copenhagen, tasked with developing and selling off land to provide funds for urban green infrastructure development, namely the metro system. So it's a market-based initiative with public value in mind. And it's interesting because currently only 2,500 people are living in this neighborhood, but over the next 30 to 50 years, there should be 45,000 inhabitants, and the plan is that there will be 35,000 jobs. So it's a significant urban development project that has a long timeline, and this makes it, of course, very relevant and interesting for us as researchers. In addition, there's many different aspects that are occurring in the neighborhood that touch on the SETS framework. So there's a nature park that is going to be developed, 28 hectares, the largest park that's been developed in Copenhagen since the late 19th century. And this is heavily focused on biodiversity, although there are tensions around recreation and biodiversity. There's also huge infrastructure being put in place, not only 2 or 3 metro stations, but also the completion of the Eastern Ring Road in Copenhagen is happening in this neighborhood. In addition, there's also production terminals here for container ships, as well as for cruise ships. So there's some really interesting economic, social, and ecological aspects happening. And as you'll see from the pictures that I'm going to show, the neighborhood is located essentially at sea level. So there's some very pertinent questions here around climate change adaptation over time. Affordable housing is also at the heart of this project. The City Council last year passed a law saying that 40% of the new housing units that will be built here should be affordable, which is ironic because this is seen as a luxury neighborhood. So it will be curious to follow sort of the price level of what affordable housing actually looks like. The intentions are good, and we plan to follow it. This is a picture of the neighborhood that has most recently been developed, and you can either call it a huge planning success or sort of a catastrophe, because here in the background we have luxury housing, and you can see that this picture is taken from 2020. It was a huge draw when the city was shut down and we needed to be outside and there was no other place to go to. So there's almost a sense of overcrowding or overpopularity in the neighborhood already. So what does that look like when we're balancing these kind of needs of local residents, but also the needs of accessibility for nature and recreation for the rest of the city? Huge infrastructure projects are coming in here, which raise questions around what kind of mobility should be prioritized. When the Eastern Ring Road is completed, it will make Copenhagen a more car-centric city, which, you know, is not really what the city is known for. It's known more as a bicycle and green mobility city. So there's some interesting tensions here. The metro is coming in, although monies that are being spent on the metro here could be spent in areas of the city that have sort of more traffic and need. So there's also an interesting question around allocation of resources and why or how transit-oriented development can also link to luxury housing and potential green gentrification. And as I suggested, this is a site of production and consumption in terms of container terminal. The nature park is coming in, and currently there are red listed species and really important sites of migratory bird landings in a Northern European context here on site. So it's interesting to consider how these different uses and sort of plans for the neighborhood actually work together holistically under this sort of guise of nature-based solution. So I'll give you an example of how we are working with this over a short and long-term period. As many researchers, we're tasked with doing teaching as well as research. So we've tried to think about how we can combine our teaching with research and do research-based teaching. So we've connected this research project to teaching and supervision. We're also running individual research projects together with end users, meaning external actors that also have a stake in the area. And we're focused on long-term data gathering and observation. So one example is that in my class that I teach for master's level students focused on nature resource management and landscape architecture and planning, we are using a data-driven approach to green space planning, meaning that the course uses the digital platform Maptionnaire to gather information around preferences for residents in the neighborhood for what this new nature park should actually look like. And we're doing this by sending the students out to collect data and to interview residents, but we've also used money from our course to actually do a survey of the neighborhood with 15,000 survey links sent out, and we've gotten 2,000 responses back, which is a robust 10% response from the neighborhood, which indicates that there's a very high interest and engagement from the neighborhood. And what we will do is we will continue this survey over the next 15 years, every 5 years, if not 20 years, because the timeline for the park development is the next 15 to 20 years. And in that regard, we will be able to gauge shifting preferences in residents' values and use of green spaces over time. In addition, we'll also be able to understand how places are used, where there's accessibility, what sort of visions are actually winning out, and if those reflect sort of the visions of residents. And this is relevant data not only for us as researchers and for the students who get to understand how data-driven approaches can impact strategies for green space planning, but also for the external users that are involved not only in my course, but also in sort of the shaping and visioning of this park. So different municipal organizations, as well as different NGOs and neighborhood organizations. And as I suggested, we're connecting this to our research by sort of using the classroom as a platform for engagement with the external users, but also engagement with the data. And in this regard, we're really looking at site-specific data. So Maptionnaire, what happens with Maptionnaire is that you receive a link to a map. You're asked to sort of map where close by to where you live, so the closest street corner so as not to reveal your own home address, but just to show sort of where you're at on the map. And then we've asked residents to actually go out and start mapping the places that they like or that they dislike. We've also asked them to prioritize where they would like to see biodiversity enhanced, where they'd like to see wild nature enhanced, where they would like to see more recreation. And this is relevant because in a quickly densifying and growing city like Copenhagen, there are actually huge conflicts over nature-based solutions. Should they be recreation oriented? Should they be biodiversity oriented? Biologists have really sort of won in the discourse around biodiversity in a Danish and Copenhagen context, meaning that biodiversity is understood as nature that's not touched. So this is very interesting for us as researchers. Can we potentially sort of decode some of these debates and break them down into more nuanced perspectives by showing overlaps between residents' preferences, their use of the space, and sort of municipal visions, and compare those with other perspectives from stakeholders. And as I suggested, there's end users in line here. So the municipality is following what we're doing and we'll be presenting this data to them. They're also very interested in following our research over time. This is just one example of kind of a social ecological coupling that we are following long term. Yet there are many other examples that I think I've raised here, whether it's about green mobility, whether it's about housing, whether it's about economic development, whether it's about perceptions of nature. Also working together with landscape ecologists to really do much more deep ecological studies. There's so much potential here also around the Øresund, or the waterways that are touching the area as well. So tons of potential here. And what's of course interesting is that Copenhagen is a city that people follow and that is known for best practice examples in terms of nature-based solutions. So it becomes an interesting site for an eLTER systems approach as a comparative platform. Many of the indicators that we can work with here in Nordhavn can also be understood and translated to other sites, and results can be scaled up. So in this regard, because I also am in the Department for Geosciences and Natural Resource Management, there is huge potential, and I'm already starting this partnership, to work with geoscientists as well, to start to think about soil science, to think about aspects of around carbon absorption, other much more kind of technical studies that have to do with the eLTER systems approach. And the results here also speak to these grand challenges that are outlined in the proposal around biodiversity loss, controls of ecosystem functions, climate, water, and food nexus, as well as social ecological systems. So we just are really looking forward to further sort of exploration with this data and to better understanding the approaches, and also welcoming partnerships with others here in the NATURA network around these kind of questions and pursuits. So with that, I'll stop sharing my slides and then I can hand the platform over to you, Nikos.
Thank you, Natalie. Really a great job tying it up together and showing the couple steps forward we've taken about looking about where the overlapping interests are. Before Nikos gets on, I'll just ask one question, Natalie. Our colleagues right now are in Rome discussing what set of standard observations will be required of all of our sites across Europe and all of our platforms across Europe. And I'm wondering if, and you started to touch upon that, what would be, the wish list of socioeconomic variables that you would want tracked over long time periods to be able to both track your own site over time, but also to be comparable across Europe? Does anything come to mind?
Sure. So I think the first element is thinking about affordable housing, how we understand that, how we define it, how it's accessible, who owns it, what sort of systems do we have, because we can't talk about green solutions without talking about who has access to green solutions. And we have access to solutions when we can afford to live nearby them. So I think that's a main point here that we should have focus on. And many European countries have a legacy of kind of post-World War II welfare housing that would be very interesting to study and look at, and to start understanding and categorizing the kind of housing families that we have and how these link to different kinds of UGI planning regimes. And making links to ecological and technological solutions, as well as the social ecological aspects, would be very interesting. So I would say that that would be the most important aspect, but also thinking about how cities are sites of production as well, and to start understanding how production and political economy link into these different criteria, and how do questions of political economy, meaning sort of who governs systems, what values are important and for whom, and which values dominate in UGI planning and management and nature-based solutions, that would be really important to link in a broader European context and to understand.
Wonderful, thank you. Nikos, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, good afternoon to all. It is very nice to be here. I wanted to present to you the work that we have been doing here in Greece. And as part of the eLTER Greece network, one of the things that we want to do is to promote nature-based solutions. Maria Mimikou is not going to be able to attend today. She has other commitments, but she is part of the eLTER Greece, and she has the Hydrologic Observatory of Athens. I'm going to focus my presentation today for the example that we have here, which is the Kiliaris Critical Zone Observatory. After I came from the US, I came back to Greece. I established in 2004 the Kiliaris Critical Zone Observatory, where we established, we have been doing a lot of hydrometeorological monitoring, geochemical monitoring, a lot of soil surveys. But in general, one of the things that we want to do is to study soil formation, soil degradation. We have soil fertility plots. And also we wanted to study sustainable water and soil management. It was extremely important to me because we are in a semi-arid climate. We have thin soils, and we are about 300 kilometers from Sahara. So the issue of desertification has been extremely important. One of the aspects of modeling and monitoring some observatory here in Crete is that these sites range from an elevation of sea level, and they go up to 2,500 meters. So you, within a very short distance, you have a very extreme relief to handle. So we have established in our critical zone observatory, or the eLTER site, meteorological and hydrological stations. We have our geochemical stations and the experimental farm. And we have been conducting monthly geochemical monitoring of surface and groundwater for many stations. So we have a long-term data series for both hydrologic and geochemical data. What it is unique about Crete and the Kiliaris Critical Zone Observatory is that most of the watershed is based on karst. And as you see this, and it's not only the watershed, but also the water is coming from the extended watershed. Outside of the watershed, the water is coming into the basin, and it is ending up in the springs that they are close to the sea. The green signs that you see here are sinkholes. We have 750 sinkholes outside the watershed, and together with the faults, redirect the water to the spring that it is coming towards 5 kilometers away from the sea. So trying to understand and model the water pathways is extremely important if you want to try to do any design that has to do with flooding or even water management with drought and so forth. The other aspect that it is interesting in Crete is that, for instance, here we have a tributary that it is a temporary river. And so in what you see in the lower part of the picture, you see the clean water coming from the left and the sediment, full of sediment water coming from the right. The reason that it has full of sediment is because it is a temporary river and you have a flash flood. And basically within, you could have a flood that would raise the level 2-3 meters, and then within 20 minutes it is gone. So this kind of flash flood phenomena we need to be able to model and try to take under consideration if we want to manage the water in Crete. But one of the problems that we have, the area that it is of the water, so that it is close to the sea, it is prone to flooding, it is prone to riverbank erosion, and that has adverse effect to the riparian forest. This is a kind of, this is part of the February of 2019 flood. Of course, the picture was taken the day after the flood. During the flood, we weren't out there. It was quite dangerous. And that created significant erosion. It toppled down the sycamore trees, the riparian forest, and created a lot of problem and damage in the area. Of course, the issue of the riparian forest and the problems that we have, that we are losing the riparian forest, we were able to see it since 2004 when we started the observatory. We saw that every other year, because of the floods and so forth, one after the other tree would fall down. And basically in the past, before agriculture started cutting down the sycamore trees, we had a riparian forest that was extending 20 to 30 meters on either side of the river for about 5 kilometers. Nowadays, we have a line of trees, as you see here, along the river bank, and that's what it is remaining. So basically, from the early beginning, we have understood that we really need to restore the riparian forest. And that, for instance, on the left-hand side, you see that we had orange tree roots, and the orange trees, the roots do not hold the soil and the bank, while the sycamore trees and the local vegetation is the one that will hold the bank and it will hold against erosion and against the problems that you have and the damage. So the nature-based solution that we wanted to promote had to do with the primary was to restore the riparian forest. So basically, as part of the paper that we wrote, detailing the design of how we did the flood protection and the riparian forest restoration, the first thing that you need to have is you need to have a vision, because this vision is going to take you all of the years that you're trying to persuade the locals that that's what you should be doing, and you need to do the study and you need to restore the forest. Of course, you have to do, once you have been funded the study, you have to do a certain baseline studies, which have to do the hydrologic studies, hydraulic studies, forest assessment, and erosion studies. And then after that, you need to start designing the NBS with the stakeholder input. You need to do the design assessment with stakeholder consultation. And then after that, go into the procurement, implementation, and NBS monitoring. I have to tell you that in this whole process, as we are speaking, the environmental impact of the design is at the Ministry of Environment, and we are waiting from the minister to sign it before we will be able to go out to procurement and implementation of the project. That's what I was telling you earlier, is that you have to do the delineation of the floodplain, the surveying, hydrologic studies, hydraulic studies. But all of these things, you really need to have information, and you need to be able to model the site, the hydrology of the sites, the floods of the site, and that's where you need. That's where we are coming from, the eLTER long-term network that we have been able to support this information. At the same time, we have done a riparian forest vegetation, and we found 46 different types. 12 of them are allochthonous and 34 of them are autochthonous. But then again, all of these species are very close to the river, and basically agriculture has been extended all the way to the riverbank. Here you can see some of the different landscapes that you see along the different stretches of the river. But the important species is that we have the Platanus orientalis, the sycamore basically, and we have the white willows are the two primary species that we want to restore. As part of the eLTER work that we have been doing, we have been modifying the different hydrologic models, like here the SWAT model. We have modified it in such a way that we will be able to model the springs, and we have added a karstic submodel. So we developed the karst SWAT model, and the data that we have collected, we have been able to model the hydrology of the main site and as well as the tributaries. And then from there, we will be able to identify the 50-year flood, and from the 50-year flood to identify what is a floodplain. Now, of course, this the area that in red that has been flooded means that all of if a land, an agricultural land, is part of the floodplain, what it means, according to the Greek legislation, is that the farmer can farm it, but he cannot transfer the farm or sell it or do any legal transfer to the next generation. So that was extremely important, because as we were trying to negotiate how long it was going to be the riparian forest, in other words, how much of their land they were going to give up in order to establish this riparian forest, this was part of our negotiation and of our stakeholder involvement. So basically, the design was to contain the flood to 20 meters on either side of the banks. And basically, and here you can see the design, and rebuilt the riparian forest with the same type of vegetation that it was before, based on the forest analysis. So basically, we have done a lot of meetings with the people in order to be able to come to consensus and everybody to agree. So we will be able to proceed and finalize the study, and then eventually be able to implement it. Of course, the benefits and co-benefits of this type of approach is that we have a sustainable protection of the river, improvement of the biodiversity, high ecological value in the recreational area, improvement in the quality of life and social cohesion. Here we could have a collaboration of tourism and agricultural sectors with the potential of new jobs. But I think the most important thing is that you can use it, or the locals can use it as a reference point for agricultural development. It's a marketing tool, because you have been creating riparian forest and reclaiming by reclaiming agricultural land. We have conducted also a benefit cost analysis of the ecosystem services, and basically we see that the benefit to cost is 7.67, which means that the benefits are 7.5, 8 times more than the actual cost of the construction. Of course, in order to get to this point, because this is the first nature-based solution pretty much in Greece, we had to go through to overcome significant legislative barriers. It has been a very lengthy approval process, because multiple institutions, they have to approve and show that there is no conflict, from archaeology to forestry to NGOs and whoever you can think of. 10 different approvals before the ministry would sign. We had financial barriers, both in terms of trying to obtain the funding. That's why it took 15 years before the study was funded. Now we are trying to find money through structural funds or the European Investment Bank to try to finance the project. We have a series of technological barriers that we need to overcome. And then, of course, there's the social barriers that I have been talking to you. And then, of course, as part of eLTER, one of the things is that you need to have a series of KPIs. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you need to monitor the effectiveness of the NBS. The very last thing that I wanted to tell you is that this idea, now we are extending it to the whole basin. And basically, we have tried to apply what we would call nature-based solution bundles to try to solve problems while we are trying to optimize the water ecosystem food nexus. So here, for instance, in the Nikolaidis basins, we have identified 3 areas. The yellow area, this is the area where it is producing a lot of the sediment and the erosion. We have intensive soil erosion. The reason that we have intensive soil erosion is because they have clear-cut the forest. They have planted the olive trees, but they have done no protections because the slope over there, as you can see, it is very steep. So with no protection or try to protect from soil erosion, you have a lot of problems. So to try to restore this area and from soil erosion is one of the issues that we want to address. The second issue is that in the valley, we have intensive agricultural practices and soil degradation. If you look at number 3, the soil map, this is the soil organic carbon map. What you will see is that the low values of soil organic carbon is in the valley and the high values is up on the mountain. The reason, of course, that the high values of organic carbon is up on the mountain is because that's where we have the free grazing of livestock. So what we need to do is to try to think of different nature-based solutions that will be able to improve and solve while we are optimizing the water and ecosystem and food nexus. And as part of the lenses, this is a PRIMA project. We have identified a series of NBS bundles that we would be able to use. And first, we will be testing them at a smaller scale. And simulating them at the larger scale and trying to see how we will be able to optimize and the benefit of these solutions. At the same time, we have tried to understand, we have been doing a lot of stakeholder involvement, and we have been, this is the LLA, the Learning Action Activities, that we have been combined with the causal loop diagrams. And potentially we would be able to try to develop them into participatory dynamic system model. The focus there is on agriculture, and it is basically on technology adaptation, and we are trying to understand bottom up how why farmers are not using technology to improve irrigation and to improve fertilization and so forth. So as you can see, we have been using a lot of focus groups in very relaxed settings, where through this type of discussion with a lot of food and drinks, of course, to increase participation, we have been able to try to understand and create these causal loop diagrams and understand where we should be focusing and where we should be changing policies in order to improve the technology adaptation to farming and optimize, again, the water ecosystem food nexus. Again, our focus there using the NBS is to enhance the water ecosystem food nexus. But we have been using technologies for irrigation based on demand of the tree, and in order to reduce water consumption, to soil organic matter incorporation to increase soil structure and increase the soil water retention. And of course, we needed to move into organized livestock, not free ranging, in order to be able to reduce erosion up on the mountains, increase the biodiversity, and at the same time be able to collect the manure for organic fertilization of the fields that will be combined with agroecological practices and enhance also the biodiversity of the valley. So the regeneration of soil will increase fertility and increase the biomass production. And in this way, we are improving the nexus, and we are improving the life and the well-being of the people in the area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikos. It should be noted that Nikos's research site is not only being used to study nature-based solutions, but is also a critical zone observation site, and is also a long-term social ecological research platform. So if his research program looked very highly diverse and really proceeding in every direction, it's because that's exactly what's happening. Nikos, can you just share with us what kind of research team, what the expertise of your research team is? Obviously, you're not working alone there.
No, well, we have people who are from computer science, environmental. I'm in an environmental engineering department. So as part of the environmental engineering department, there are a faculty that they are doing all sorts of work. So there is a multidisciplinary team. But most of the work that we are doing is in the environmental engineering area.
Thank you. Tessa, do you want to take over? Or should I keep moderating or?
It doesn't, you're welcome to. We're basically just moving into the questions and answer portion of this webinar. So if you have any questions for Daniel, Natalie, or Nikos, please speak up or put them in the chat, and can get those answered.
There is my colleague, Jonathan, from my department. Thank you for coming, Jonathan. Asks a question for Natalie. I'm wondering if you are accounting for the interrelations between NBS and the built environment in Copenhagen. Jonathan, by the way, also works on NBS solutions. Would be very interesting to use this great opportunity to measure, calibrate, and then develop prediction methods for the impact of NBS on energy, comfort, and life. No, that's LCA, in and around the buildings there. Jonathan, interject and say what LCA is. Life cycle analysis, yeah?
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you very much. Life cycle assessment and like the interrelations between NBS nature-based solutions and the performance of the built environment is extremely interesting. I wonder if you are heading that direction.
So I think that's a really good question. And just in the last 2 months, the University of Copenhagen has funded a Green Solutions Lab, which I'm heading, that focuses on this neighborhood. And if you could talk about how NBS has been understood in this neighborhood since it was sort of envisioned as a master plan site back in 2008, I would say energy efficiency and carbon neutrality have been the foremost focus. So that's definitely the way in which sustainability has been described and sort of measured, and it's almost like a green jobs agenda, you could say. So there's quite a bit of data on that and a lot of interest in it, although how robust it actually is, I think, is another question. So that would be a really interesting research project that I think many researchers are actually keen to get into. Also quite politicized, right? So we have to tread sort of carefully, but definitely a relevant question in terms of what is neutrality, what is energy efficiency, who defines that, and which standards are we living up to? So what we're trying to bring to this neighborhood now is more of a biophysical perspective. How do we integrate aspects of biodiversity, ecosystem planning into a site that is, I mean, it's built on kind of rubbish. So it used to be it's all infill, basically, from the late 19th century, this whole site that I showed. So what nature is becomes like a really interesting discussion. And that's linked to these issues of, you know, more technical aspects that you just brought up. So that's where the sets model becomes very interesting and relevant, how these crossovers interact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's one question in the chat, but I'll first go to Stefan or Stephen. Please correct me.
Stefan is all right. Hello. Natalie, I maybe I've overheard it, but I would just like to know whether there is, say, some prospect in your study on the Nordhavn that is providing stability to it over a certain period of time. I mean, the process is long-term of developing Nordhavn. And do you have something where you say a framework for funding is in place that would also allow researchers to monitor for 5-10 years?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that's essentially what we're sort of exploring right now, is how can we actually get more funding in place? And what I just mentioned before is that the University of Copenhagen has now funded this Green Solution Center, which means that we can work together with external partners, whether it be the municipality or the city and harbor agency or with an architecture firm, to ask some of these questions that have been brought up here in the chat and in this discussion today. Albeit minimal amounts, right? But you could sort of call it pilot studies. We've also gotten money through our education to do this survey where we got, you know, a robust response rate. So right now we have ad hoc funding, but these pilot projects can point to longer term, more robust funding, which is what we're looking at here in the thematic working group, is how could we work within the eLTER framework to find more robust funding resources. And I mean, I'd be open to other people's interest in this site as a case study if there are other funding opportunities. I think it could go in many directions.
And I'll just add to that, because Timon's question was about how to best access and conduct research in eLTER sites and platforms. And we have transnational access grants available just for that purpose. And I can attest to the fact that in the early years that we had these grants, they weren't as competitive. So many of my students won them and conducted comparative research across Europe on different social ecological questions. Now they tend to be a little bit more competitive, but and the advantage would go to those who aren't associated with the network. And so, you know, you have 2 weeks, they're small. They don't require a really long application process, and they're specifically available for students, postdocs, also researchers who want to use, who want to visit several of the sites, conduct research in collaboration with the local researchers. And I encourage you all to at least check the website, if not to apply as well. Timon, does that address the question? Can't hear you, even though you did turn off your, you turned off mute. The other thing I would say is collaborating with any of the research teams. We have another site that's called DIMES, which is an inventory of all of our sites, their locations and descriptions and contact people. I'll put that link in the chat. And collaborating with the researchers, most of them would be happy to have the opportunity to host collaborators. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so I just add that the DIME site to the list and hand it back over to Tessa.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Nikos and Natalie for presenting. So I didn't mention this in my introduction because my brain was still waking up. it's a little slow at that point, but we are hoping to have more thematic working group presentations and do this kind of as a series in our webinars as updates from our thematic working groups. We now have 10, if you can believe it. So we will have quite a bit to hear from. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone for joining. We'll be sending out more communications on that if you'd like to join that as well. Thanks so much for the presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.